Hi, everyone, and welcome. My name is Curt Witynski, and this is one of a series of interviews I've been conducting as part of the More Housing Wisconsin project, which is co-sponsored by the League of Wisconsin Municipalities, the Wisconsin Realtors Association, and the Wisconsin Builders Association. The focus of this series of interviews is on housing, and more particularly, what can local governments, what can Wisconsin municipalities do to generate more housing to house the people who want to live there? We have been meeting with and learning from local leaders, both from the private sector and the public sector, who've had some experience and some success in implementing changes to their zoning code and other strategies that might generate more housing in their communities. Joining me this morning is someone who's been on the front lines of trying to implement policy changes to bring about more housing in their city, and that is the zoning administrator for the city of Madison, Katie Bannon. Before Katie became zoning administrator, I'll just do a little introduction for her. She worked for the Department of Natural Resources for a year, and then prior to that, she spent most of her professional career in the state of Indiana, where she worked for cities like the city of Indianapolis for several years, and also the city of Bloomington, Indiana. Katie, thank you for joining me this morning. I really appreciate you taking the time to be with me and talk about some of the really intentional movement and efforts and steps that City of Madison has taken to try and reduce some of the barriers to housing and hopefully result in the construction of more housing and apartments in the city. So thank you, Katie.
Thanks for having me, Curt.
So I thought we'd start, I wanted to set the context a little bit for our listeners who aren't familiar with the housing dynamic in the city of Madison, and just kind of give a couple statistics that might explain why the city is so intentionally focused on creating more housing. Really, the bottom line is that Madison has more people who want to live here than there is housing, both apartments and single family homes, to house all the people who want to live here. And that's now and looking to the kind of immediate future, where we anticipate population will grow at a certain rate and there's just insufficient apartments and housing to house them. And try to illustrate some of that situation, that housing situation that exists in Madison, I have a couple statistics. So between February of 2023 and February of 2024, so the last year, City of Madison had the second highest rate increase in the U.S. In rental rates. Similarly, the City of Madison has the third highest, tightest rental market. So I think there's a 3.6% vacancy rate. So currently, the third highest of the 100 metro areas, largest metro areas in the United States. Madison comes in number 3. And then one more statistic that I find interesting is that there are more 20-somethings, Generation Z, they call them, more 20-somethings moving to Madison than some of the cities that you think of in the United States that draw a lot of young people, like Austin, Texas, Nashville, Tennessee, Atlanta, Georgia. So Madison's right up there with kind of drawing and attracting 20-somethings to move here, who all need apartments or eventually houses to live in, and we're not keeping up with the rate of people moving here. So with that introduction, I thought maybe I'd ask you first, Katie, if you could just briefly summarize what the city is doing, particularly with respect to zoning changes, to hopefully remove some of those barriers to private sector creating housing in the city. And I'm talking about during the time, this is over the last several years, and primarily during the time that you've been zoning administrator.
Yeah, sure. So, zoning regulates development, what you can build where, how, what it can be used for. In the state of Wisconsin, zoning really can have an effect on housing from a supply standpoint. So I feel like we hear often, why can't you do rent control? Why can't you do inclusive zoning where a certain number of units are required to be affordable? So we have more affordable units. Well, those are things that the state legislature has preempted local communities from being able to do.
Yeah.
So on that side, the affordable housing side, City of Madison has been doing a lot to increase funding for affordable housing, and that's a lot of how we're getting more affordable units. what zoning could do is a lot of just supply. How do we increase the supply? So that's a lot of what I've been working on. I started at the city in December 2021, but the work started before I got here. So it all started with our comprehensive plan. And a lot of what zoning is about is implementing the comprehensive plan. And it's a really powerful tool compared to some of our other tools for implementation because of the law. So it really is something you can start to see the impacts right away. So in 2013, we did a total revamp to our zoning code to really bring it up to what we wanted to have as a community. And some of that was, how do we increase supply? How do we make it easier to do multifamily within the city of Madison? Because we know that's a big piece, is increasing supply, is increasing density in ways that make sense within our existing neighborhoods. But more recently, it's really an iterative process with a zoning code. There's always things you can be doing and tweaking. And one thing I really like about how we think about the zoning code in the city of Madison is it's not a static document. We're probably 10 to 15 times a year making a zoning code change to try to improve a variety of things. But a big focus has been housing because, as you said, Curt, we're having such a demand. All of Wisconsin is having these issues, but Madison even beyond other communities. So like most recently, we had already in 2021 allowed accessory dwelling units, kind of those additional backyard houses. There's a lot of different names for them, so they can either be attached or detached. In the city of Madison, we had allowed those as a permitted use, but only for single family homes and only if one of the two units was owner occupied. So that went well. We saw a little bit of movement. Then we had the transit-oriented development overlay where, well, okay, with a duplex, you can have an accessory dwelling unit. And now the most recent change there has been to allow accessory dwelling units with multifamily as well, and removing that owner occupancy restriction, which we knew was something that had deterred some people from doing them and was a challenge for financing. But we've done a variety of things. I feel like I said, we do so many of them, but a big thing of just making it easier to do more housing with less special approvals.
Yes. So you mentioned transit overlay district. Could you just talk about that a little bit? What's that involved?
Yeah, so the transit-oriented development overlay district is a mouthful. We call it TOD here often in shorthand. A lot of what we've been thinking about as a city is if we're growing and we're adding density, well, that we don't want to see traffic congestion. So how do we make sure housing is supporting transit and transit supporting housing, right? They go kind of hand in hand. And so the overlay is kind of in addition to your zoning districts that have all these regulations, is in a certain area of our city where we have higher frequency transit, that's where we really want to focus and provide some incentives to have more housing units. So there was kind of a bump in the number of dwelling units you can have there in this overlay district. And it's quite a substantial portion of our city. And then there were also some design requirements. So from a site planning perspective, how can we design a site that supports transit and supports pedestrians accessing businesses, other establishments, and housing? That was just, I think last year, 2022.
Yeah,
beginning of
right.
2022.
And I remember right
or 2023. I don't, the years.
I know it all runs together. And I remember right before you started as zoning administrator, I think some of the changes that were implemented, they got kind of the first, I don't know, media's attention was making it easier to build multifamily in multifamily zoning districts and mixed use zoning districts. In other words, changing it from a conditional use for some of these three triplexes and fourplexes and things like that, where those types of buildings already existed in some of these zoning districts, and change it from a conditional use requirement, I think, to a by right, as permissible. And also, I think at the same time, there was a slight shrinkage of the minimum lot size where these types of structures could be built. And I think those are some things that other communities could, learn from and maybe copy. And was there much pushback for that type of change? And you came on right after that, but I realized I don't know, has there been more a rise in more neighborhood concern, existing homeowner concern about some of the changes that have been implemented since then?
There definitely have. So as you mentioned, that was before my time.
Yeah,
Changing from the conditional uses to permitted uses for multifamily, kind of going up a level and right sizing a lot of the lot
yeah,
minimums as we looked at what lot area made sense. So I maybe avoided some of that controversy, but
yeah.
did experience more with things like changing the number of people who can live in a house together. That was pretty controversial. I feel like
That's
every little thing has had, some, neighborhood concern, I would say.
yeah. So like you just mentioned that really the definition of family also is that part of it, the number of individuals that
Mhm,
could be in a house who are unrelated. So we're talking
mhm.
about making it easier for someone to rent out their house to people who they're not related to. Is that what the change you were referring to?
Yeah, so we had historically limited, I believe, is about 30% of our land area. The housing in those areas was limited to if you were a renter and not all related to one another, you can only have two people living in that house. So this was just, like I said, this is iterative, just like another way to increase housing choices within the community.
Right, right. Um, I'm looking at my notes here. I was trying to think of some other allow more stories in exchange for low cost housing. Was that part of the kind of the zoning changes where if a developer proposes a percentage of the apartment buildings will be devoted to lower cost housing, they could increase the number of stories they could build?
Yeah, so I think I had mentioned that we've been preempted that we can't require affordable units, but we can incentivize it. So this was a really, I thought, creative solution our former planning director thought of. In our downtown, we have height limits, and our height limits were based on number of stories and the size of those stories.
Yeah.
And one thing we've done is in those downtown areas, if someone's providing a certain number of affordable units or certain square footage of affordable units or has funding with the city to provide affordable units, they can do additional stories within the maximum height.
Okay.
And it works because housing typically has shorter floor plates. So we have had some developers definitely interested in this, and I think it's going to be something we're looking at. How do we expand this potentially outside the downtown? This way to incentivize for developers who are interested in it. They get something more that they couldn't otherwise under the zoning, and
Yeah.
then they're providing affordable housing units.
One other thing I'd read in the newspaper has been covering some of the steps the city's been taking. This week in particular, there's been a focus by the Wisconsin State Journal on this. And something I read in there that I wasn't aware of, the city, and this might be outside of zoning, so to speak, it might be more subdivision approval, but exempted work housing projects from park impact fees. So it's another way to maybe make it work financially for people to build lower cost housing without having to pay the park impact fee that ordinarily would apply. Is that
Yeah,
something?
we've been looking at kind of all possible solutions. And that was something that if it's affordable housing, we're able to offer that as an incentive as well, that you don't have to pay those parks impact fees, which can be a substantial upfront cost otherwise.
Right. So more recently, and I don't know if you were part of this, Katie, or not, if it's more the planning side, kind of the comprehensive planning side, but there's been an effort by the city to update its plans, looking to increase density. And I think city started with, certain neighborhoods. It's not citywide initially. So right now, they're focusing, from what I read in the newspaper, on, the west side of Madison, and trying to propose some changes to the comprehensive plan that will allow in the future, if property owners were interested, subdividing their land, so to speak. I think you were talking about minimum lot sizes that would shrink, or so that Some of the lot sizes weren't so large as they were maybe when they first subdivided in the 50s or 40s or 30s or something like that. Um, have you been a part of that at all, or has that been kind of a different part of the city team?
Yeah, I've been some of the internal conversations, but I'm not part of that core team
Yeah,
that's
yeah,
been out there. But yeah, it's
yeah,
definitely a discussion of like, yeah, how do we do more infill housing, particularly home ownership opportunities that aren't otherwise possible? And some division within existing neighborhoods is one way to do that.
yeah. And that part of the proposed efforts, kind of policy proposals, drew more opposition than I personally was surprised by the strength of neighborhood opposition to. In fact, one neighborhood, just to let our listeners know, decided to create restrictive covenants, privately retain the, I guess, lot sizes that they, currently have, so that prohibit individual owners from subdividing or selling off half of their lot or something like that for housing. Did that catch you or the rest of the staff? Did it surprise you, kind of the strength of the opposition to that?
I wasn't really deep in a lot of those
Yeah,
discussions.
yeah,
I knew that was something we had discussed as one of the potential plan goals. Um, you know, that's part of why we have a public input process, I think, to
right.
hear from people about what they want for their neighborhoods and make sure the plans reflect that. We all love Madison. I think that's
Yeah,
why there's
yeah,
such great engagement. And there's a lot of change going on. I sometimes say it's a really exciting time. It's
yeah,
like it's a positive, but sometimes that's tough because change is hard.
right.
And so people come out in force sometimes on certain things in our plans, and we want them to because public input is key to having good plans.
Right. And I think the city adjusted its
Mhm.
initial proposal as a result of that input. Talk a
Yep.
little bit about I think there was some similar pushback, not to the same degree, but like even to the definition of the number of people, individuals who could be in the same home or apartment. Um, and talk about some of the kind of the uh, effort to educate the neighborhoods and the public that the city staff went through on that particular piece of the zoning change that you were talking, some of the zoning changes you were talking about.
Yeah, so we had a number of public meetings, and it's really a two-way street. So some is to make sure everyone's getting clear information about what's really being proposed, right? And that we're there to really answer the question. Sometimes rumor mills in neighborhoods kind of take off, and so it's really important that we're proactive about the communication and really open in that dialogue. But like I said, it's a two-way street. So it's also for staff to listen and understand, what are the concerns. How can we address this, whether through a change in what's being proposed, or are there other things we can be doing to address these concerns? So some of the concerns with allowing more people were related to, oh, well, what about noise? And what about all these other things that come
Yeah.
as part of having more people living within your community? And so it's really good to hear those things and think about, how do we bring in MPD and talk with them about what do they do and what can we do better as a city to address any other potential impacts. So those meetings are really valuable for staff too, I would just say.
Yeah, good. So it's a learning back and forth. It's not just
Mhm.
you presenting information and not listening basically to the comments that the folks who show up are making.
Right.
Uh,
It's like a core value as a city planner that it's really about listening to the
yes,
community.
yes. Can you tell us about anything that might be coming up in the future that the city is planning on, maybe some zoning reform next year? Or like you said, it's every year there's little changes made to your zoning code. Anything in the future you could talk about?
Yeah, there's nothing on the immediate horizon,
Hmm.
but I know, we're looking at things like tweaks to lot sizes and lot widths and, things that maybe are very in the weeds, but as talk to various people trying to add housing can be these little barriers that matter. We're looking at parking policy as well. We don't
Hmm.
require parking in very many places, but there are still a few places where parking is required, and should that be something that's potentially tweaked? But I don't know, stay tuned.
Yeah, yeah. I saw it. Sometimes I think, like all professionals, we model some of our, we copy what other cities are doing successfully, right? Or what other businesses are
Absolutely.
doing. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I saw that City of Austin they're going through a various phases of zoning changes, and they just changed their lot size minimum from, I don't know, 5,700 down to 1,800, which was a huge move. And I saw their council meeting at the time that they actually voted. There was lots of public hearings, obviously, building up to that, but the final council meeting, they had so much public testimony, it went till 2 a.m. So they had to postpone the vote until the next morning at 10, where they took 2 hours more of public testimony. So anyway, I'm sure that lies in your future too, Katie. So just a little bit of warning. Let me just kind of final question here, and I really appreciate you taking the time to be with us. Are there any lessons maybe that you've learned, staff has learned over the course of the last several years in trying to, make some of these zoning changes for increasing density and moving barriers to housing construction?
I think one thing is you really can't over communicate. So I've had, just a lot of individual meetings with alders, meetings with neighborhoods, working with your communications team is really key. Definitely something I've learned.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you're communicating at all phases, policymakers, the mayor, council members, but also to the public to keep everyone informed and get feedback from everyone. That's a full-time job right there. That's main. Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Well, Katie, we're gonna close it off here, and I really, because I don't want to take too much of your time. I'm sure you got to get to a next meeting, but thank you very much for taking the time to join me this morning to talk about City of Madison and its efforts to change its zoning code, and the main lesson learned is communication, constant communication with the public and policymakers. Thanks a lot, Katie.
Thanks, Curt.